I eased my foot onto the brake as I turned into their street at exactly 4:12 p.m., the late afternoon sun cutting through the windshield. And for a moment, I just sat there with the engine running, listening to it idle like it always had, steady, predictable, the way things are supposed to be after you've lived long enough to believe you've earned that kind of quiet. And I remember thinking how strange it was that there were no other cars in the driveway, no neighbors gathered, no sign of urgency, because when someone says their parents are sick, truly sick, there's always something. An ambulance, a nurse, even just a car left crooked in a hurry. But there was nothing, just a still house and the faint smell of cut grass drifting through the open window. And I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than I needed to, the leather warm under my palms, and I told myself I was overthinking it. That at 68 you learn to doubt your own instincts before you doubt the people you love. But then I turned off the engine, and the silence that followed felt heavier than it should have, like the moment right before a storm you can't see yet. And I stepped out of the car, closing the doors softly, almost carefully, as if noise itself might change something, and I walked up the driveway, counting my steps without realizing it. 1, 2, 3, maybe 20 feet to the side gate. And I noticed the kitchen window was open about 6 inches, just enough for voices to carry. And that's when I heard her laugh. Vanessa, a sharp, clean laugh, not strained, not worried, not the kind of sound you make when your parents are in bed upstairs struggling to breathe. And I stopped right there with my hand still on the gate, because something in that sound didn't belong to the story I had been told at 2:30 that afternoon when she said, "Richard, I have to take Sophie to my parents. They're not doing well." And I believed her. Of course I did, because that's what you do after 12 years of marriage. You believe the simple explanations, the ordinary ones, the ones that don't ask too much of you. And I pushed the gate open just enough to slip through, the hinge giving a small click that sounded too loud. In the quiet yard, and I moved along the side of the house, keeping close to the wall, not because I was hiding, not yet, but because something in me had already shifted, some part of my mind stepping back, observing instead of trusting, the way I used to when I was still working, when numbers mattered more than feelings. And as I reached the corner near the kitchen window, I heard another voice, Sophie's, lighter, impatient, and then Vanessa again, clearer now, closer, and she said, "His brakes won't last another week." Just like that. No hesitation, no context, just a statement placed casually into the air like she was talking about the weather, and my body reacted before my mind did, my hand tightening around the small silver key I was still holding, the one from my BMW, the edges worn from years of use, and I felt the air leave my lungs in a way that didn't come back right away, and I stayed there, perfectly still, because moving felt like it would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. And Sophie answered, her voice almost amused. "After the insurance pays out, we're done." And I remember thinking that I must have misunderstood, that there had to be some other explanation, some other man, some other situation, because the alternative required too much. It required me to believe that the woman I had shared a home with since 2012, the woman who had stood next to me in a small ceremony with 23 guests and promised to build something steady together, was now standing 10 feet away discussing my death as if it were a scheduled appointment. And I leaned slightly closer to the window, not enough to be seen, just enough to hear better, the scent of something cooking drifting out, garlic, maybe rosemary. And it hit me in a way I didn't expect, because Helen used to cook with rosemary, always said it made a house feel lived in, and for a second, just a second, my vision blurred and I had to close my eyes, pressing my lips together, because grief doesn't disappear, it just waits, and it finds its way into moments like this when you're already breaking open. And I swallowed hard, forcing myself back into the present, back into the voices inside that kitchen. And then a third voice spoke. A man's voice, calm, controlled, one I recognized even before I placed it, Ethan Ward. And he said, "We moved the money Friday, no delays this time." And something inside me settled then, not calm, not acceptance, but a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in months, because numbers, timelines, plans, those I understood, those I could work with. And I opened my eyes, staring at the reflection in the glass, not at them, but at myself, an older man standing outside his own life, listening to it be dismantled piece by piece. And I realized, with a precision that cut through everything else, that this wasn't a misunderstanding, It wasn't a single mistake. It was a plan, structured, timed, measured, and I was already late to it, already behind. And then Sophie said something else, softer this time, almost thoughtful. How much did we get so far? And Vanessa answered without hesitation, without even lowering her voice. 280,000. And he still hasn't noticed. And I felt my fingers tighten around that key until the metal pressed into my skin, because I knew that number. I knew exactly where it could come from. And I knew exactly how long it would take to move that much without setting off alarms. And I understood, in that moment, that I hadn't just been lied to. I had been studied, mapped, reduced to patterns and habits they could exploit. And before I could step back, before I could even decide what to do next, Ethan spoke again, his tone sharper now, more certain. Then next Friday we finish it, 1.4 million total, and he won't even see it coming. It was nearly 4:40 p.m. by the time I slid back into the driver's seat, closing the door with more care than I had ever used in my own life, as if the sound alone might pull them out of that kitchen and into the driveway where I was sitting. And I kept my hands on the steering wheel for a few seconds without starting the engine, just breathing, slow, deliberate, counting again without meaning to, 1, 2, 3, the way I used to when a client's numbers did not add up and I needed my mind to stay steady instead of drifting into assumption. And then I started the car, the engine turning over with the same familiar rhythm, unchanged, reliable, as if nothing had shifted in the world outside that driveway. And I backed out slowly, checking the mirrors out of habit, not because anyone was there, but because habits are the last thing that leave you when everything else starts to break. And I drove down the street at exactly 20 miles per hour, not faster, not slower, because speed would have meant panic, and I was not ready to admit that yet. And by the time I reached the main road at 4:47 p.m., I could feel something settling into place inside me. Not calm, not even control, but a structure, a framework, the same one I had used for 42 years working through financial statements and discrepancies that did not belong. Because what I had just heard was not emotional. It was not impulsive. It was a plan, and plans leave traces, and traces can be followed if you know where to look. And by the time I pulled into my own driveway at 6:20 p.m., the sun was lower, the light softer, the house exactly as I had left it at 2:10 p.m. when Vanessa told me she would be gone for the evening. Everything in its place, everything ordinary, and I sat there again for a moment before getting out, the engine ticking as it cooled, and I caught the faint scent of lavender as I opened the door, not real, not present, just a memory triggered by the quiet, by the way the house looked when no one was inside. And it hit me harder than I expected, sharp and sudden, because Helen used to leave the windows cracked just enough for the air to move through the rooms, said it kept the house from feeling sealed off. And for a second I leaned against the car, my hand pressed flat against the door, and I closed my eyes, just long enough to feel it, the absence, the weight of it, the way it never really leaves, and I covered my mouth with my hand as my breath caught, just once, just enough to remind me that grief does not disappear. It just waits for a moment when you are already unsteady, and then I straightened up, wiping my hand against my jacket, because there was something else now, something immediate, something that required me to think, not feel, and I walked into the house, closing the door behind me, the sound echoing slightly in the quiet, and I went straight to my office at 6:27 p.m., the same room where I had seen Vanessa standing at my desk on January 12th at 9:30 p.m., telling me she was organizing tax documents, and I had believed her, because that was a reasonable explanation, and reasonable explanations are what people like me rely on. And I sat down at the desk, turned on the monitor, and opened my banking software, the screen lighting up with the familiar interface I had used for years, the same one I trusted, the same one I had stopped checking as closely after I retired in 2018, because there was no reason to, because nothing had ever been wrong before, and I started with the last 30 days, scanning through the transactions line by line, the way I used to teach junior analysts to do, not looking for anything specific, just letting patterns emerge. And it took less than 3 minutes for the first one to stand out. A transfer of $48,000 dated 14 days earlier, labeled as a vendor payment, which made no sense because I had no active vendors, not anymore. And I clicked into it, opening the details, following the routing information, and I felt my jaw tighten slightly as I saw the account number it had gone to. Unfamiliar. External, not one of mine, and I leaned back in the chair, just for a second, letting that settle, because one transaction could be a mistake, a glitch, something explainable. And then I went back, expanding the range to 90 days, and then to 180, and I found the next one at exactly 9:12 a.m. 6 weeks ago, $72,000, same routing pattern, same labeling, and then another at 3:40 p.m. 3 months before that, $96,000, and I did the math automatically, without writing it down. 48 plus 72 plus 96, $216,000, moved in 3 transactions over a span of roughly 14 weeks, and I felt my hands go very still on the desk, not shaking, just still, because stillness is what comes before action, and I stared at the screen, at the numbers, at the timestamps, and I could see it now, the spacing, the intervals, the way each transfer was placed just far enough apart to avoid immediate detection, and I understood that this was not new, this was not sudden, this was something that had been built over time, refined, adjusted, and I leaned forward again, clicking deeper into the account details, tracing the destination account, looking for any identifier, any name, and for a moment there was nothing, just numbers, routing codes, institution identifiers, and then I saw it. A linked profile name buried in the metadata, not prominent, not obvious, but there, and I read it once, then again, just to be sure I was not misinterpreting what I was seeing, and my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with age or stress, because the name was not a company, not a vendor, not an institution, it was a person, and it was a name I had heard less than 2 hours earlier standing outside that kitchen window, and I sat back in the chair, the room suddenly feeling smaller, the air heavier, and I realized, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that the financial part of this had already begun, that it was already in motion, already structured, already executed at least 3 times without my knowledge, and I reached for my phone on the desk, not to call anyone yet, not to confront, just to have it in my hand, something solid, something immediate, and as I unlocked it, a notification appeared at the top of the screen, a new email, timestamped 6:31 p.m., from a sender I did not recognize, with a subject line that read, "Scheduled transfer confirmation, Ethan Ward, $112,000 pending for Friday." It was 6:31 p.m. when that email appeared, and I did not open it right away, not because I was afraid of what it might say, but because I already knew enough to understand that whatever was inside would not change the direction of what had already begun, it would only confirm the scale of it. And I needed a few seconds to think clearly before I added another layer to something that was already moving faster than I had anticipated, so I set the phone down on the desk, face up, and I looked back. At the screen in front of me, at the transactions, at the timestamps, at the quiet, orderly lines of data that had always made sense to me. And I let my mind move through them the way it used to, step by step, pattern by pattern, because this was not the first time I had seen money disappear. It was just the first time it had been my own, and I noticed something then that I had missed in the first pass. A small detail, almost nothing, but enough. The intervals between the transfers were not random. They were structured around specific days of the week. Always a Tuesday or a Friday. Always between 9 a.m. and 3:45 p.m., times when I was either out of the house or occupied. Predictable, reliable, the way I had always been, and I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting that settle, because predictability is not just a habit, it is a vulnerability when someone else knows how to use it, and I reached for the phone again, unlocking it slowly this time, and I opened the email, the subject line still sitting there, unchanged, scheduled transfer confirmation. Ethan Ward, $112,000 pending for Friday, and I tapped it, watching as the message expanded across the screen, clean, formal, automated, the kind of notification that is generated by systems, not people, and I read it once, then again, taking in every detail, the routing number, the receiving institution, the exact date and time of the scheduled transfer, Friday at 10:15 a.m., 3 days from now, and I felt something inside me shift again, not shock this time, not even anger, but a kind of alignment, because now I had a timeline, a fixed point, something I could work toward instead of reacting after the fact. And I set the phone down again, more carefully this time, and I stood up from the desk at 6:38 p.m., pushing the chair back slowly, the wheels making a soft sound against the hardwood floor, and I walked out of the office, through the hallway, past the living room where everything was still exactly as it had been that morning, the cushions in place, the lamp turned off, the faint scent of lavender still lingering in a way that felt almost deliberate now, like a reminder, and I stepped out into the garage, the light flicking on automatically at 6:40 p.m., casting a pale, even glow over the space. And there it was, the car, exactly where I had left it, clean, still, ordinary. And I stood there for a moment without moving, just looking at it. Because it was no longer just a car, it was part of the plan, part of what I had heard less than 2 hours earlier, and I walked toward it slowly, the concrete cool under my shoes, and I reached into my pocket, pulling out the silver key, the one with the worn edges, the one I had been holding when I stood outside that kitchen window, and I unlocked the door, the soft click echoing slightly in the enclosed space, and I opened it, leaning in just enough to smell the interior, leather, faintly warm, unchanged, and I sat down in the driver's seat at 6:42 p.m., closing the door behind me, the sound sealing me inside, and I placed the key into the ignition but did not turn it, not yet, because I needed to see something first, and I reached down, adjusting the seat slightly, and I leaned forward, pressing the brake pedal gently with my right foot, just enough to feel the resistance, the pressure, the way it should respond, and for a second it felt normal, firm, responsive, exactly as it had always been, and I let my foot off, then pressed again, slightly harder this time, and I felt it, a subtle difference, not dramatic, not immediate, but there, a softness where there should have been firmness, a slight give that did not belong, and I sat back, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and I stared straight ahead through the windshield, not moving, not speaking, just processing, because this was not something you guessed at. This was something you confirmed, and I turned the key, starting the engine at 6:44 p.m., the sound filling the garage, steady, familiar, and I shifted into reverse, easing the car back exactly 3 feet, then into drive, moving forward again, slow, controlled, and I pressed the brake once more, a little firmer this time, and the response was delayed, just slightly, just enough to notice if you knew what you were looking for, and I stopped the car, shifting back into park, and I turned off the engine, the sudden silence returning, heavier now, more defined, and I sat there for a few seconds, my hands resting on the wheel, and I could feel my heartbeat, steady but present, and I exhaled slowly, once, then again, and I opened the door, stepping out at 6:47 p.m., closing it behind me, and I walked around to the front of the car, crouching down slightly, not to inspect anything specific, not yet, but to ground myself in the reality of it, because what I had heard and what I had just felt were now connected, no longer separate pieces, and I stood up again, turning toward the side of the garage where the small security camera was mounted, the one I had installed 3 years ago after a minor break-in in the neighborhood, something I had almost forgotten about, and I walked over to the control panel on the wall at 6:49 p.m., tapping the screen to bring up the recorded footage, and I scrolled back through the timeline, hours, then days, moving slowly, methodically, until I reached the previous night, 2 a.m., and I paused, watching as the grainy image resolved into the familiar outline of the garage, empty at first, then the side door opening, and a figure stepping inside, tall, deliberate, moving with a kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you are and what you are doing, and I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes narrowing slightly as the figure moved into the light, and I recognized him immediately, even before the timestamp confirmed it, 2:03 a.m., Ethan Ward, standing in my garage, alone, and I watched as he walked toward the front of the car, crouched down out of frame, and remained there for exactly 1 minute and 42 seconds before standing up again, wiping his hands on a cloth, and turning back toward the door, leaving the same way he had entered, and I did not move as the footage looped back to the beginning, the screen returning to stillness, because there was nothing left to interpret, nothing left to question, and I reached out, my finger hovering over the playback controls, when my phone vibrated sharply in my pocket at exactly 6:52 p.m., and I pulled it out, the screen lighting up with an $1 that was updated this morning at 10:07 a.m. It was just after 9:10 a.m. the next morning when I stepped out of the elevator onto the 5th floor of a glass building I had not visited in nearly 18 years, the kind of place where everything smells faintly of polished wood and quiet money, and I adjusted my jacket as I walked down the hallway, my footsteps soft against the carpet, steady, controlled, because this was familiar ground in a way nothing else had been since yesterday afternoon, and I stopped in front of the door marked Margaret Klein, Forensic Accounting. The letters clean and understated, and I knocked once, not too loud, not too soft, and a voice from inside said, "Come in." Calm, direct, the same tone I remembered from when we worked together back in 2006, when numbers were still the only thing either of us worried about. And I opened the door, stepping into an office that looked exactly the way I would expect hers to look. Organized, precise, a desk with 3 stacks of files aligned perfectly, a laptop, open at a slight angle, and Margaret herself standing near the window, turning to face me with a small, measured smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and she said, "Richard Cole, it has been a long time." And I nodded once, closing the door behind me, because there was no reason for anything else yet, no need for explanation, not until I had something concrete to place in front of her, and I walked to the desk, setting my phone down at exactly 9:12 a.m., screen facing up, and I said, "I need you to look at something." And she gestured toward the chair without hesitation. "Sit." And I did, lowering myself into it slowly, feeling the weight of the last 12 hours settle into my shoulders in a way I had not allowed myself to feel until that moment. And I unlocked the phone, pulling up the email, the transactions, the footage timestamps, and I slid it across the desk toward her, and she picked it up, her eyes moving quickly, efficiently, scanning, not reacting, not yet, just taking it in. And the room stayed quiet for a full 20 seconds. Long enough for me to hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system, long enough for me to notice the way the light from the window fell across the edge of the desk, and then she set the phone down, aligning it perfectly with the corner of a file, and she said, "This is not accidental." And I nodded once, because I already knew that, and she continued, "This is structured, layered, and deliberate." And she reached for her laptop, typing in a few commands, pulling up what looked like a secure database, and she said, "Give me the account numbers." And I recited them from memory, each one precise, each one exactly where it needed to be, and she entered them without asking me to repeat myself, her fingers moving quickly across the keys, and within 30 seconds she had something on the screen, and she turned it slightly so I could see, and there they were, the transfers, not just the 3 I had found, but more, older ones, smaller amounts at first, 20,000, 35,000, building gradually over time, and she said, 14 months, Richard, maybe a little more, and I felt my hands tighten slightly on the armrests of the chair, because that timeline matched something else, something I had not fully processed yet, and she continued, "The pattern starts in early January 2024, increases in frequency by June, and stabilizes at higher amounts by September." And I could see it now, the progression, the testing phase, the escalation, the confidence that comes when no one stops you. And she clicked again, opening another window, and she said, "The receiving accounts are layered through 3 institutions, but they converge here." And she pointed to a name on the screen, and I did not need to lean closer to read it. Ethan Ward, the same name from the email, the same man from the footage, and Margaret looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since I had walked in, and she said, "You know him." Not a question, just a statement, and I nodded once, because there was no point in denying what was already evident, and she leaned back slightly in her chair, folding her hands together, and she said, "Tell me about your wife." And the question landed differently than I expected, not because it was surprising, but because it forced me to place something personal into a situation that had, until now, been entirely structural, and I took a breath, slow, measured, and I said, "I met Vanessa in 2011. We married in 2012. She was steady, or at least she appeared to be." And Margaret nodded once, waiting, and I continued. "She started a boutique business in 2022, small at first, but she invested heavily, too heavily. And by March of that year, she had lost $190,000 and taken on another $87,000 in debt." And I paused there, because saying the numbers out loud made them feel more solid, more connected to what I was seeing now, and Margaret's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened slightly, and she said, "That is your trigger point." And I felt something inside me tighten at that, because she was right, because that was when things would have shifted, when pressure turns into action, and she continued, and beyond the money. And I hesitated for just a second, because that part required something different, something less precise, and I said, control, I think, and position. She has always cared about how things look, what they represent, being the one who holds everything together, and Margaret nodded again, slower this time, as if confirming something internally, and she turned back to the screen, typing again, and she said, then this is not just about recovering what has been taken, and I felt my chest tighten slightly, because I already knew where she was going, but I needed to hear it, needed it stated clearly, and she stopped typing, her hands resting on the keyboard, and she looked at me, directly, without hesitation, and she said, this is about what they are planning to take next, and the room went quiet again, heavier this time, more defined, and I sat there, feeling the weight of that statement settle into place, because it aligned with everything else, the email, the footage, the conversation in the kitchen, and before I could respond, before I could ask the question that was already forming, her printer on the side table activated with a soft mechanical sound at exactly 9:28 a.m., and a single sheet of paper slid out slowly, and Margaret reached for it, glancing down as she picked it up, and her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, a slight tightening around the eyes, a shift in focus, and she handed the paper across the desk to me without saying anything, and I looked down at it, reading the header first, then the body, and I felt the air leave my lungs in a way that did not return immediately, because it was not a financial document, not a transaction record, not something I could categorize and process in the same way. It was a legal filing, timestamped 10:07 a.m. the previous day, listing a policy update with a beneficiary change, and the name printed clearly, without ambiguity, was not mine, not a joint designation, but a single, exclusive recipient, Vanessa Cole, and at the bottom of the page, in a smaller line of text, it stated, primary beneficiary to receive 100% of policy value totaling $1,400,000 upon claim verification. I did not speak for a few seconds after reading that page, not because I did not understand it, but because I understood it too clearly, every number, every word placed exactly where it needed to be, and I held the paper in my hands at 9:29 a.m., feeling its weight, light but final, the kind of document that does not ask for interpretation, only acceptance, and I set it down on Margaret's desk slowly, aligning it with the edge the way she had aligned my phone earlier, because that small act of control was the only thing I had at that moment. And I said, 1.4 million, and my voice came out steady, even, which surprised me, and she nodded once, not looking at me, but at the screen, already moving forward, already working through the next layer, and she said, that matches the policy update and the projected transfers. And I leaned back slightly in the chair, my hands resting on my knees, because now it was no longer fragments, no longer separate pieces, it was a complete structure, and I could see it in my mind the way I used to see complex financial models, all the parts connected, all the flows aligned, and I said, 280,000 already moved, and she added, plus the pending 112,000 on Friday, and I continued, plus the 150,000 loan in my name, and she finished, brings the total exposure to 542,000 before the policy. And we both stopped there, because the next number did not need to be said out loud, it was already present, already defined, 1.4 million, and I felt something inside me shift again, not shock, not even disbelief, but a kind of internal collapse that came from seeing the full scale of something you had been standing inside without realizing it. And I pressed my hand lightly against my mouth, just for a second, because I needed to steady myself, because this was not just money, this was time, trust, years, and I could feel the edges of it, sharp, precise, and I lowered my hand, forcing myself back into the structure, back into the numbers, because that was where I could function, and I said, 14 months. And Margaret nodded. 14 months of controlled transfers, escalating amounts, and now a terminal event tied to a policy. And she turned the screen back toward herself, typing again, pulling up additional records, and she said, there is more. And I did not react to that immediately, because I expected it now, expected there to be another layer, another connection, and she opened a file labeled with a date, March 2025, and she said, "This is where it accelerates." And I leaned forward slightly, watching as she scrolled through the entries, and I saw it. A cluster of smaller transactions, 5,000, 8,000, 12,000, all within a 2-week window. And I said, "Testing liquidity," and she nodded. "And response time." And she clicked again, opening a separate document. And this one was not a bank record, not a transaction log, but a communication log, metadata pulled from linked accounts. And she said, "They have been coordinating." And I felt my chest tighten slightly, because coordination meant intention, meant planning beyond opportunity, and she highlighted a series of timestamps, late at night, early morning, consistent intervals, and she said, 2 a.m., 3 times in the last week. And I thought of the footage, of Ethan in my garage at 2:03 a.m., and the pieces aligned again, tighter now, more complete, and I said, "They are synchronizing actions with access windows." And she looked at me then, a brief glance, acknowledging the point, and she said, "Yes." And she printed another document, a second sheet sliding out at 9:36 a.m., and she handed it to me without comment, and I took it, scanning it quickly, and this one was different again, a summary, a consolidation, and at the top, in bold, it listed the total financial movement to date, $280,000 confirmed, $112,000 pending, $150,000 in liabilities, and beneath that, a projected total including the insurance policy, $1,400,000, and I felt my hands go still again, because seeing it laid out like that removed any remaining distance, any space for interpretation. And I said, quietly, "They are not just taking money," and Margaret responded, just as quietly, "They are closing the account." And the words settled in the room, heavy, final, and I leaned back again, my gaze dropping to the floor for a moment, because there was a point where analysis ends and reality begins, and I had reached it, and I could feel it, the weight of it, the fact that this was not something that would resolve on its own, not something that could be corrected with a conversation or a misunderstanding clarified. And I thought of Helen then, not in a distant way, not as a memory, but as something immediate, the way she used to stand in the doorway of the kitchen in the evening light, the faint scent of lavender following her, and I heard her voice, clear, simple, "Always check the details, Richard." And I closed my eyes for just a second, because the detail had been there, all of them, and I had chosen not to see them. And when I opened my eyes again, I felt something settle into place, not comfort, not relief, but direction, and I looked back at Margaret, and I said, "What is the next step?" And she did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the phone on her desk, dialing a number I did not recognize, and she waited, the line ringing once, twice, 3 times, and then someone answered, and she said, "This is Margaret Klein. I need to verify a policy update for Richard Cole, effective March 24th, 2026. And she listened for a moment, her expression unchanged, and then she said, "Yes, I will. Hold." And the room went quiet again, the only sound the faint hum of the building, and I watched her, waiting, because whatever came next would define the rest of this. And after a few seconds, she spoke again, her tone slightly sharper now, more precise, and she said, "I need the authorization log, specifically who initiated the beneficiary change and from which device." And there was a pause, longer this time, and I felt my pulse in my hands, steady but present, and then Margaret's eyes shifted slightly, just enough for me to know something had changed, and she said, slowly, clearly, "You are telling me the request was submitted from inside his home network at 10:07 a.m. yesterday." And she paused again, listening, and then she added, "And the device used was registered under his name, Richard Cole." It was 8:05 p.m. when I parked across the street from the house again, the same spot I had used the day before, 12 feet back from the driveway, far enough to stay out of sight, but close enough to see the kitchen window if the light was on. And I turned off the engine, sitting there in the quiet, my hands resting on the wheel, because this time I was not reacting, I was confirming, and I reached into the glove compartment, pulling out my phone, opening the voice memo application I had installed 3 months ago after reading an article about contract disputes, something that had seemed unnecessary at the time, and I checked the battery, 87%, enough, and I stepped out of the car at 8:07 p.m., closing the doors softly, moving along the same path as before, through the side gate, along the wall, each step deliberate, measured, because now I knew exactly what I was looking for. And when I reached the window, the light was already on, voices inside, clearer than yesterday, more relaxed, and I positioned myself just to the side of the frame, close enough to hear, far enough to remain unseen, and I tapped the screen once, starting the recording at 8:08 p.m., the small red indicator confirming it. And I held the phone steady in my hand, my fingers still, my breathing controlled, because this moment mattered, not emotionally, but structurally. This was where they would confirm what they believed was already secure, and Vanessa spoke first, her tone light, almost casual. Friday at 10:15. It is already scheduled. And Ethan responded immediately. 112,000 clears first, then the rest follows. And I felt something inside me tighten, not surprise, not anymore, just recognition, because those numbers matched exactly what I had seen on the screen that morning. And Sophie's voice came next, sharper, impatient. And the policy? And Vanessa answered without hesitation. Updated yesterday, 10:07 a.m. Everything goes to me. And I closed my eyes for just a second, because hearing it out loud removed any remaining distance, any space for doubt, and I opened them again, focusing on the sound, on the words, because this was the evidence. This was what mattered now, and Ethan said, total is 1.4 million, plus what we already moved. We are looking at over 1.6, and Sophie laughed softly, a short sound, and said, he really never checked anything. And Vanessa replied, he trusts patterns, not people. That is why this worked. And the sentence landed harder than I expected, because it was accurate, because it described me in a way I had never considered as a weakness, and I felt my hand tighten slightly around the phone, but I did not move, did not shift, because this was not the moment for reaction, this was the moment for confirmation. And Ethan continued, his voice lower now, more focused. After Friday, we finalized the rest, no delays, no changes, and Vanessa said, there will not be any. Everything is already in place. And there was a brief pause, a few seconds of silence where I could hear the faint sound of something being set down on a counter. And then Sophie asked, and the car? And Vanessa answered, her tone unchanged. It will not hold, not at highway speed. And I felt a cold clarity move through me, because that connected everything. The footage, the break, the timing, and I pressed my lips together, steadying myself, because this was the point where the full structure revealed itself. And Ethan said, then we do not need anything else. The claim will process within 30 days. And Vanessa replied, and by then, we are gone. And I let that settle, the finality of it, the completeness, because this was not a partial plan, not a contingency, it was an exit. And I glanced down briefly at the phone, confirming the time, 8:11 p.m., 3 minutes of recording. Enough, more than enough. And I stopped the recording with a single tap, the screen returning to normal, and I stepped back from the window slowly, carefully, retracing my steps along the wall, through the gate, back toward the street. Each movement controlled, because now I had what I needed, not just suspicion, not just inference, but their own words, their own timeline, their own numbers. And I reached my car at 8:13 p.m., opening the door, sliding into the driver's seat, and I sat there for a moment before starting the engine, the phone still in my hand, the recording saved, labeled automatically with the time, and I looked at it, the small file that now contained everything. And I felt that same internal shift. Again, the one that comes when something moves from uncertain to defined. And I started the car, pulling away from the curb at exactly 8:14 p.m., merging into the road, the headlights cutting through the dark, and I drove, not fast, not slow, just steady, because there was no urgency now, only sequence. And as I turned onto the main road, my phone buzzed again in the center console, a new notification, and I glanced down at it briefly, just long enough to read the sender and the first line of the message. And it was not from Margaret, not from the bank, not from anyone I expected. It was from Vanessa, timestamped 8:15 p.m., and it read, Richard, where are you right now? Because the insurance company just called me and said someone has been asking questions about your policy. It was just after 10 a.m. the next morning when I sat across from the attorney in a quiet office on the 3rd floor, the blinds half closed, sunlight cutting through in thin lines across the desk, and I placed the phone down in front of him at exactly 10:02 a.m., The recording already cued, my hand steady as I pressed play, because there was no room for interpretation anymore, no space for explanation, only evidence. And he listened without interruption, his expression unchanged as Vanessa's. Voice filled the room, clear, confident. Friday at 10:15. It is already scheduled, followed by Ethan. 112,000 clears first, and then the rest, the policy, the numbers, the plan. And when it ended, the room went quiet again, the kind of silence that comes when something moves from theory to fact. And the attorney leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together, and said, "This is more than financial misconduct." And I nodded once, because I already knew that, and he continued, "We need to act before Friday." And I felt that word settle into place. Friday, 10:15 a.m., the same time I had seen in the email, the same time they believed was secured. And I said, "What is the first step?" And he turned his monitor toward me, pulling up a document already prepared, and said, "We freeze everything, immediately." And I watched as he typed, entering my account numbers, the trust structure, the transfer instructions, and at 10:07 a.m., he printed 3 documents, sliding them across the desk, and said, "Sign here, here, and here." And I picked up the pen, the same deliberate motion I had used for decades, and I signed my name 3 times, each one identical, each one precise, because that was what I knew how to do. And he took the papers back, scanning them quickly, and said, "This moves 1.4 million into a protected trust, effective immediately." And I felt something shift again. Not relief, not yet, but containment, because now there was a boundary, something they could not access without going through a system that would not respond to manipulation. And he continued, "Next, we notify the bank and the insurance provider." And he picked up the phone, dialing a number, his tone changing slightly as he spoke, more formal, more direct. "This is a legal hold request under account holder authorization." And I watched him as he spoke, as he referenced case numbers, policy identifiers, timestamps, each detail placed exactly where it needed to be. And I realized then how different this was from the day before, how different I was, because I was no longer standing outside a window listening. I was inside a system responding. And at 10:18 a.m. he ended the call, setting the phone down, and said, "The accounts are flagged. Any transfer will trigger an alert." And I nodded once, because that was what I needed: time, structure, control. And he added, "Now we involve law enforcement." And he opened another file, attaching the recording, the transaction history, the insurance document, and he said, "We do this properly, no confrontation, no warning." And I felt my hands tighten slightly on the edge of the chair, because that part required restraint, and restraint is harder than action when you know what is coming. And I said, "They think it is already done." And he looked at me, steady, and said, "Good, let them." And the simplicity of that statement settled something inside me, because it aligned with the structure, with the timing, with the fact that this was no longer about reacting. It was about allowing them to move forward into something that had already changed. And at 10:32 a.m., he printed one more document, sliding it across the desk, and said, "This is the formal report. It will be filed within the hour." And I glanced at it briefly, seeing the summary, the numbers, the names, all of it reduced to a clean, precise account of what had happened and what was about to happen. And I leaned back slightly, my hands resting on my knees, because there was a moment, right there, where everything paused, where the next step was no longer mine to take alone, and I could feel it, the shift from personal to official, from internal to external. And I thought of Helen again, just for a second, the way she used to look at me when I was working late, the quiet understanding, the trust. And I felt my throat tighten briefly, just once, before I forced myself back into the present, because this was not about the past anymore. This was about what came next. And I stood up at 10:35 a.m., adjusting my jacket, and the attorney stood as well, walking me to the door, and he said, "Do not change your routine, do not alert them." And I nodded, because that was the plan, that was the structure. And I stepped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind me. And as I reached the elevator, my phone vibrated in my pocket again, a sharp, immediate sound that cut through the quiet. And I pulled it out, glancing at the screen, and it was not a call, not a message, but a bank alert, timestamp 10:36 a.m., and I opened it, reading the single line of text as the elevator doors slid open in front of me. Attempted transfer of $112,000 blocked at 10:35 a.m. from account ending in 7421. It was 6:30 p.m. when I walked through the front door of my house. The same house I had left at 9:50 a.m. that morning, and everything looked exactly the same. The same furniture, the same light coming through the windows, the same. Quiet. But it felt different now, defined, like a space that had already shifted before I stepped back into it. And I set my keys down on the table by the door, the small metallic sound echoing slightly, and I did not call out, did not announce that I was home, because there was no need to, and I moved into the living room slowly, my eyes taking in the details without focusing on anything in particular, because I already knew where this was going, and I heard her voice from the kitchen, calm, controlled. "Richard?" And I turned slightly toward the sound, my posture steady, my expression neutral, because this was not a moment for reaction, and she stepped into the doorway at 6:31 p.m. Vanessa, exactly as she had been the day before, composed, measured, her hands resting lightly at her sides, and she looked at me for a second, just a second longer than usual, and said, "You did not answer my message." And I nodded once, not apologetic, not defensive, just acknowledging the statement. And I said, "I saw it." And there was a brief pause, a small space where neither of us moved. And then she took a step closer, her tone shifting slightly, not enough for someone else to notice, but enough for me. "The insurance company called me today," she said. "They said someone has been asking questions about your policy." And I held her gaze, steady, because this was the point where the structure met the surface, and I said, "I wanted to understand it better." And she smiled then, a small, controlled expression, the kind that looks natural if you do not know what is behind it. And she said, "You never cared about that before." And I felt something settle inside me, because she was right, because I had trusted the structure without checking it. And I said, "Things change." And she watched me for another second, her eyes searching, measuring, and then she said, "Did you talk to anyone?" And I did not answer immediately, not because I was hesitating, but because the timing mattered, the way it always does. And I said, "Yes." And her expression shifted again, just slightly, a tightening at the corners of her mouth, and she asked, "Who?" And I stepped further into the room, closing the distance between us by about 6 feet. And I said, "Someone who understands numbers." And she let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. And she said, "Richard, you are overthinking this." And I shook my head once, slowly, because that word did not apply anymore. And I said, "No, I am thinking clearly for the first time in 14 months. And that number landed. I saw it in the way her eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second. And then she recovered, quickly, smoothly, and said, "I do not know what you think you found." And I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone, holding it loosely in my hand, not raising it yet, not showing it, just letting it be visible. And I said, "I heard everything yesterday." And the room went still, completely still, the kind of silence that does not exist unless something has shifted beyond recovery. And she did not move for 2 seconds, maybe 3. And then she said quietly, "You should not have come there." And the sentence was not defensive, not surprised, it was corrective, as if I had made a procedural error, and I felt my hands remain steady, because this was the moment where everything aligned, the plan, the evidence, the timing, and I said, "You should not have used my house at 10:07 a.m. yesterday to change the policy." And that landed differently, heavier, more precise, and I saw it. The break in her composure, small but undeniable, and she took a step back, just one, and said, "I do not know what you are talking about." And I tapped the screen. Once, starting the recording, and Vanessa's voice filled the room, clear, unmistakable, Friday at 10:15. "It is already scheduled." And I watched her as she listened, as the words moved through the space between us, and her face changed, slowly, not dramatically, but enough, the confidence shifting into something else, something tighter, more controlled. And when it ended, I lowered the phone slightly, and I said, "It is all there." And she looked at me, directly, no pretense now, no attempt to soften it. And she said, "You were not supposed to hear that." And I felt something in my chest tighten, just once, because there it was, not denial, not confusion, but confirmation, and I pressed my hand lightly against the edge of the table beside me, grounding myself, because this was the moment where it could have gone in a different direction, where emotion could have taken over, but I did not let it. And I said, "The transfer at 10:35 a.m. today was blocked," and her eyes shifted again, quickly this time, and she said, "What transfer?" And I held her gaze, steady, and said, $112,000. And she did not respond immediately. Not this time. And the silence stretched for a few seconds, and then she spoke, her voice lower, more controlled than before. "You think you can stop this?" And I did not answer that, because the answer was not mine to give anymore. And at that moment, at exactly 6:34 p.m., there was a sharp knock at the front door, 3 firm strikes, measured, official, and both of us turned toward the sound, and a voice from outside called out clearly, "Richard Cole, this is the police department. We need you to open the door." It was 6:34 p.m. when I walked to the door, each step measured, deliberate, the sound of my shoes against the floor louder than it should have been, or maybe I was just more aware of it now. And I reached for the handle, pausing for half a second before turning it, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that once this door opened, everything moved from private to official, from contained to exposed. And I pulled it open, revealing 2 officers standing on the porch, both in uniform, both composed, the older one stepping forward slightly, and he said, "Mr. Cole." And I nodded once, "Yes." And he continued, "We received a report regarding potential financial fraud and a related safety concern." And I stepped back, opening the door wider. "Please, come in." And they entered without hesitation, their presence filling the space in a way that shifted the entire atmosphere of the house. And I closed the door behind them at 6:35 p.m., the sound final, and when I turned back, Vanessa was still standing in the same spot, her posture unchanged, her expression controlled. But there was something different now, something tighter, more focused, and the officer looked between us briefly before saying, "We are going to need to ask a few questions." And I nodded, because that was expected, and I gestured toward the living room. "Of course." And we moved there together, the 4 of us, the distance between each step feeling deliberate, structured, and I sat down first, choosing the chair by the window, the same place I had sat countless evenings before, and the officers remained standing for a moment before the older one took out a small notebook, glancing at it briefly, and said, "Mr. Cole, can you confirm that you filed a report earlier today at approximately 10:32 a.m. regarding unauthorized financial activity totaling $280,000? And I said, "Yes," my voice steady, and he nodded, writing something down, and then he said, "And that you provided audio evidence of a planned transfer of $112,000 scheduled for Friday at 10:15 a.m. And I said, "Yes," again, because there was no need for elaboration, and he turned slightly toward Vanessa. "Ma'am, can you confirm your name?" And she responded immediately, "Vanessa Cole," her tone calm, controlled, and he asked, "And your relationship to Mr. Cole?" And she said, "I am his wife." And there was a brief pause, the kind that holds more than the words themselves, and the officer nodded once, making another note, and then he said, "We also received confirmation from the insurance provider that a policy valued at $1.4 million was updated yesterday at 10:07 a.m. from within this residence." And I felt my hands remain still on my knees, because that detail had already settled into place, and Vanessa did not respond immediately this time, not for 2 seconds, maybe 3, and then she said, "I do not have access to his accounts." And her voice was even, measured, but I could hear the shift, subtle but present, and the second officer, younger, stepped forward slightly, holding a tablet, and said, "The authorization log indicates the request was submitted from a device registered under Mr. Cole's name, but the login credentials used do not match his standard access pattern." And I watched Vanessa as he spoke, as the words moved through the room, and her expression remained controlled, but her eyes shifted, just slightly, calculating, and the older officer looked back at me. "Mr. Cole, do you have any additional evidence you would like to provide at this time?" And I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone, and I said, "Yes," and I placed it on the table between us, tapping the screen once to bring up the recording, and I said, "This was recorded at 8:08 p.m. last night." And I pressed play, and the room filled again with the same voices, the same words, the same numbers, Vanessa's voice, Ethan's voice, Sophie's voice, all of it clear, all of it precise, and I watched the officers as they listened, their expressions shifting slightly, not dramatically, but enough. The recognition of structure, of intent, and when it ended, the younger officer looked at the older one, a brief glance that carried more than words, and the older officer closed his notebook, placing it back into his pocket, and he said, "Ma'am, we are going to need you to come with us to answer some questions." And Vanessa did not move immediately, not this time. And for a moment, the room held that stillness again, the kind that comes before something breaks or shifts or resolves. And then she turned her head slightly, looking at me, not at the officers, not at the door, but at me, and her expression changed, not controlled now, not measured, but something else, something sharper, more direct, and she said, quietly, "You should have stayed out of it." And I felt something in my chest tighten, just once, not from fear, not from doubt, but from the finality of it, because there it was, the confirmation, the absence of denial, the presence of intent, and I did not respond, because there was nothing left to say, and the officers stepped closer, their movements calm, procedural, and Vanessa stood up slowly at 6:39 p.m., smoothing her hands over her sides as if adjusting something invisible, and she turned toward the door, walking with them without resistance, without hesitation, and I remained seated, watching as they moved through the hallway, the sound of the door opening, then closing, and the house fell quiet again, the same quiet as before, but different now, defined, and I sat there for a few seconds, maybe 10, maybe 15, before I stood up, moving slowly toward the window, looking out at the street, at the police car parked outside, the lights off, the engine running, and I watched as they placed her in the back seat. Not forcefully, not dramatically, just procedurally, and the door closed, and the car remained there for a moment, idling, and I felt my hands relax slightly at my sides, because the structure had completed its first phase, the containment, the interruption, and I turned away from the window, walking back into the living room, the space feeling larger now, emptier, and I sat down again, the chair creaking slightly under my weight, and I exhaled slowly, once, then again, because there was still more, there always is. And as I reached for my phone on the table at exactly 6:42 p.m., the screen lit up with a new notification, a message from an unknown number, and I opened it, reading the single line of text as it appeared. "This is Ethan Ward, and you just made a very expensive mistake." It was 7 p.m. when I stepped into the garage again, the overhead light clicking on automatically, casting that same pale glow across the concrete floor, and I stood there for a moment without moving, just looking at the car, the same car I had driven for 8 years, the same one I had trusted without thinking, and I walked toward it slowly, my hand reaching into my pocket for the silver key, the edges worn smooth from years of use, and I held it there in my palm, turning it slightly, feeling the weight of it, because it was no longer just a key. It was a point in a sequence, a place where everything had almost ended without me ever understanding why. And I stopped about 3 feet from the front of the car, the distance exact, measured without intention, and I exhaled slowly, once, then again, because the quiet in that space felt different now, not empty, but settled, like something had completed its course and left only the structure behind. And I leaned forward slightly, placing my hand against the hood, the metal cool under my fingers, and I closed my eyes for just a second, because there was a moment, right there, where everything came together, not the anger, not the betrayal, but the realization of how close it had come to working, how precise it had been, how complete, and I pressed my lips together, my hands still resting on the car, and I thought of Helen again, not as a memory, not as something distant, but as a presence that had always been tied to the way I moved through the world, the way I trusted, the way I built things to last, and I could almost hear her voice, quiet, steady. "You always believed systems were enough?" And I opened my eyes, looking at the car again, because she would have seen it. She would have noticed the details, the small shifts, the patterns that did not align, and I had not. And that was the part that settled deeper than anything else, not what they had done, but what I had missed, and I straightened up, stepping back slightly, my hand dropping to my side, because there was no more analysis left to do, no more structure to uncover. It had all been laid out, confirmed, contained, and I turned toward the workbench along the wall, where the security panel was mounted, the small screen still glowing faintly, and I walked over to it, tapping it once to bring up the footage again. The same clip from 2:03 a.m. Ethan stepping into the garage, moving with that same confidence, that same certainty, and I watched it one more time, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see it clearly, without the shock, without the confusion, just as it was. And when it ended, I turned the screen off, the garage returning to that quiet, even light, and I took a step back, my shoulders loosening slightly, because something had shifted inside me. Not relief, not exactly, but a kind of closure, the understanding that whatever they had planned had already failed, that the structure they built had been interrupted before it could complete, and I walked toward the door leading back into the house, reaching for the handle, and I paused for just a second, my hand resting on it, because I knew that what came next would not be about them anymore, not about Vanessa or Ethan or Sophie, but about what remained, what I chose to carry forward, and I opened the door, stepping inside at 7:04 p.m., the familiar space greeting me with that same quiet, but it felt different now, lighter, not because anything had been restored, but because the uncertainty was gone, and I moved into the living room, sitting down in the same chair by the window, the one I had used for years, and I leaned back, my hands resting on the armrests, my gaze drifting toward the fading light outside, and I let myself sit there, not thinking, not analyzing, just present, because there is a point where the mind stops trying to solve and simply accepts what is already known, and I stayed there for a few minutes, maybe 5, maybe 10, until the room began to darken slightly, and I reached for the lamp beside me, turning it on, the soft light filling the space, and I glanced at the table where my phone rested, the screen dark, still, and I picked it up at 7:12 p.m., not expecting anything, not waiting for anything, just holding it, the weight familiar in my hand, and I unlocked it, scrolling briefly through the notifications, the bank alerts, the messages, the call logs, all of it already processed, already understood, and I set it back down again, because there was nothing new, nothing that required my attention, and I leaned back once more, my eyes closing briefly, just for a second, because the quiet had returned. Not the same quiet as before, but something different, something earned, and I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in my chest ease just slightly, and I thought, not in words, but in a kind of understanding, that this was the part no one talks about, the space after everything has been revealed, after the action has been taken, where you are left with what remains, and I opened my eyes again, looking toward the hallway, half expecting to see movement, to hear a voice, but there was nothing, just the steady hum of the house, and I nodded to myself, once, because that was enough, and I sat there, letting the moment settle, until the quiet was broken by a soft knock at the door, not sharp like before, not urgent, but measured, almost careful, and I stood up, walking toward it at 7:18 p.m., my steps slower now, not cautious, just deliberate, and I opened the door, and Margaret was standing there, her posture the same, composed, precise, and she looked at me for a second before speaking, her voice steady. "Richard, there is one more account we need to talk about, and it is already at $260,000.